How do you get through tough times? People that know me know I've dealt with some tough times in my life. You know, whether it's a relationship or a job or just total rejection, I've dealt with it and I've recovered. And I'll try to unpack that for you a little bit more today. So I'm Roach, Mark Roach, and I'm here to try to help you get what you want and what you need and to understand the difference. I think dealing with adversity and whatever life hands you is different for every one of us. Some of us seem to have a nice flow, and others you can see just a repetitive pattern of conflict and chaos. And then some people get surprised along the way and find themselves faced with something that they never expected to have to deal with. And so a number of people that I've encountered have said, Mark, how do you hold yourself together? And I was having a conversation with someone today who is helping a friend of his deal with divorce and all sorts of awful family conflict. And it occurred to me that one of the foundations for me was, I was raised in a very religious environment, and I memorized a lot of the scripture from the Bible as a young kid. And I remember a minister saying to me at one time, when you're older, you'll be able to reflect back on this and these words will help you. And he was right. I kind of thought old would be kind of like near the end of my life rather than all through my teens, 20s, 30s, and 40s, and then into my 50s when even some bigger losses were encountered or obstacles were encountered, and even richer opportunities for wisdom and learning occurred. But when you are blindsided in life and find yourself in great despair, that's when you really find what you're made of. One of my great mentors in life, who was a Hollywood director and acting coach, that took me under his wing like a father. One of his favorite sayings was, "Character is revealed under stress." So that gave me an appreciation for those moments where I was dealing with pain and some unique forces that some of us might call evil, but nonetheless there were obstacles that I was facing. And I looked at myself and I thought, okay, well, how I deal with this, how I respond to these circumstances, they may very well define me. And maybe the only person that knows how I respond to it, because I am something of a private person trying to express myself here through communicating with others and sharing about some of these inner lessons that I've learned. But, you may be the only one that really gets it. And that's an even richer experience to be in that isolation and to not have a chance to lean on someone else. And it really forces you to use all of your senses and everything that God has given you access to in your spiritual life and your physical life to pull yourself together. And I had a father who had also pulled himself together after having some tough times in his life. And I didn't really have a full understanding of what he had dealt with in his early life. I'd heard a few stories, but I didn't have a full appreciation until he passed away several years ago. And my mother handed me a speech that she wanted me to read at his memorial service, which I did. So I'm going to read it to you. And this speech was written in 1964 and delivered at Drury College in Springfield, Missouri by my father. And at this point in his life, he had a, kind of a mixed up, he was born in the Depression and, kind of bounced around like a lot of kids did in the Midwest, trying to deal with the droughts that occurred, the farming community, with all of the changes that were taking place due to the wars and, all of the developments that were going on in the 50s. And then he found himself in the 60s as he'd gone into the Marine Corps and then was trying to figure out what he was going to do with the rest of his life. One of his greatest fears was expressing himself, especially in public speaking. So that's part of the reason I'm here today, is that he had me doing some theater and acting work and actually preaching, at a very, very young age. And as I read this to you, I think it may give you an appreciation for that you're not alone, that many of us do deal with falling apart and then trying to find a way to put ourselves back together and to hold ourselves together. Listen to this. Often a man's greatest handicap in life may be himself. Certainly in my past, this has proven true. In my early years, in my early life, I experienced much suffering. Most of the suffering was a result of my attitude, an attitude of self-pity, an attitude which would eventually lead to destruction or at least a complete failure. It would be difficult to trace the origin or this attitude, and probably even more difficult to understand. The importance of recognizing the signs of such development early in one's life cannot be underestimated. Some of the more prominent signs in my case were a lack of interest in school and a poor association with others. We moved around a lot, and in every new school I managed to get into fights. Introductory fights, you might say. They weren't very funny at the time, believe me. It's much better to put on a friendly smile accompanied by a warm, sincere handshake. Anyway, these warning signs and others went unheeded, so I somehow continued on into high school, where most of the students put the final spit and polish on their education. They were developing their minds while I was still developing my attitude. They succeeded in their educational objective, and I succeeded in developing my attitude into a rather complete inferiority complex. I even reached my success before the other students. I dropped out of high school during the final year, not to make a fortune, but in an attempt to escape the misery and torture that filled my troubled soul. This attempted escape, like most, was a failure. In desperation, I enlisted in the Marine Corps. At first, I considered this a mistake, but I soon found that the rigid control and strict discipline of the Marine Corps was just what I needed. After boot camp and combat training, I had gained about 45 pounds in weight. My health was 100% improved, and I felt like I could whip a tiger. But most of all, I felt proud. For the first time in my life, I felt proud. I became a spit and polished leatherneck. I worked hard at it, studied hard, and advanced to the rank of sergeant before the end of my 3-year enlistment. Tempted to stay in the Marine Corps, I fought off the homesickness as long as I could, but I finally gave in and returned to Missouri. After a month on our farm in Shannon County, a place that was always dear to my heart, I started working at McDonnell Aircraft in St. Louis. Here I began to slip back into my old attitude and became discontented and doubtful about the future. Factory work did not interest me, and I had no friends, and I lived by myself and suffered a lonely, pointless existence. This continued for about 2 years, and I was nearing my breaking point. Even suicide entered my thoughts. I quit McDonnell Douglas Aircraft and returned once again to our farm. On August 10th, 1959, I started to work for the police department here. I was quite pleased with my new job and the interesting future it promised. Things were going well at last. Then on the eve of Thanksgiving, I received word that my father was seriously ill and had been taken to the hospital. He passed away while I was en route to the hospital. After the funeral, I sadly looked at the family farm for the last time and returned to Springfield. The loss of my father created another void in my life, but I managed to wrap myself up in the newness of the police work. Still, I desired more out of life than just an interesting occupation. I wanted a home of my own, a family, and a reason to live. In June of 1961, I met the girl who was to change my whole life. She was different from anyone that I had ever known. She was pretty and still is. She was intelligent, sensible, but most of all, she was a true Christian. Not a demanding religious fanatic, but a patient, understanding Christian. A recent quote in the local newspaper might describe her best. It read, "One life showing the way is better than 10 tongues trying to tell it." I attended church with her every Sunday. It was different at first, but I was very interested and soon realized that here was the answer to my problem. On the 16th of July, I was baptized into Christ. The change in my life since that point is unbelievable. On February 16th, 1962, she became my wife. Later that year, we bought our first home. The following year, on October 3rd, the good Lord answered our prayers with the birth of our son, Mark. Mark is now 19 months old and is the finest son any father could hope for. I certainly have not conquered all of my deficiencies. However, I have made progress. I would not be here tonight if it were not for this change in my life. So if the greatest handicap is yourself, try a bowl of enthusiasm anew. The recipe is simple. Put everything you have into it. So when I read this at his service, the room was filled with people who had served in the department with and for my father, who was a leader in the community. And as I read it, This was around in 2009 that he passed. Men were leaving the room in groves, in tears. No one showed their emotions back then, and some of us have trouble showing them today. But this was a powerful testament to a man that had really pulled himself together and overcome many of the things that a lot of us really struggle to hold ourselves together with today. And these challenges are going to continue for future generations. We're not the first. My father wasn't the first to encounter these things. He won't be the last. I hope this may have benefited you. I'm Roach. Mark Roach. Wishing you all the best.